The mud on my boots was still wet, leaving dark, ugly streaks on the pristine white carpet of the VIP tent. I had just spent 6 hours in the vineyard trenches, battling a frost that threatened to wipe out our entire harvest, while my family threw a party to celebrate themselves. I was freezing, exhausted, and just wanted water. But my mother, Cynthia, intercepted me before I could take 2 steps. She stood there, a wall of silk and diamonds, looking at me with pure disgust. "You look like the help," she hissed. "We are done funding your dirt-playing hobby, Isabella. Sign over your trustee rights tonight. Or get out." Beside her, my sister Shelby laughed, raising her champagne flute to the crowd. "Don't worry, everyone," she announced, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Isabella is just taking a much-needed mental health break." The laughter that rippled through the room wasn't just humiliating. It was a declaration of war. Before we watch their champagne turn to vinegar, drop a comment below. Where are you listening from right now? I love seeing how far our community reaches. I didn't scream, I didn't throw my wine glass or demand an apology. I simply turned my back on the laughter and walked out of the tent. The sound of their mockery followed me for a few steps, sharp and jagged, but as soon as the canvas flap fell shut behind me, the noise was cut off. The night air in the vineyard was cool, smelling of damp earth and ripening grapes. It was the smell of my work. The smell of the legacy I had built while they were busy posing for pictures. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. Usually, confrontations with Cynthia left me trembling, desperate to fix whatever I had broken, desperate to earn my way back into their good graces. But this time, the vibration wasn't in my hands, it was in my pocket. My phone buzzed against my hip, insistent and rhythmic. I pulled it out, the screen glowing bright in the darkness. It was a notification from the trust management system, the app that controlled the entire financial nervous system of the estate. Scheduled transfer request, monthly family allowance, beneficiaries, Cynthia, Jeffrey, Shelby. Amount, $35,000. I stared at the number. $35,000. For 1 month. That was more than I paid myself in a year to manage the entire architectural restructuring of the vineyard. They burned through that money on imported silks, spa retreats, and vanity parties like the one happening 50 yards away, all while calling me the help. They truly believed that the money appeared by magic, a natural resource they were entitled to harvest. They forgot that I wasn't just the girl who played in the dirt. I was the sole trustee. My thumb hovered over the screen. For 5 years, I had hit approve automatically. I had treated it like a subscription fee for their love, a tax I had to pay to be part of this family. But tonight, looking at the mud on my boots and hearing the echo of Shelby's laugh, I realized the service was no longer worth the cost. The subscription was canceled. I didn't feel a spike of adrenaline. I didn't feel fear. I felt the cold, hard clarity of an auditor closing a bankrupt account. I tapped deny. The screen flashed red for a second, then cleared. Transaction canceled. But I wasn't done. Denial was just a pause. I needed a full stop. I opened the administrative settings and scrolled down to the security protocols. My grandfather had built this system for emergencies, for a time when the estate might be under attack. He never told me the attack would come from inside the house. I selected Protocol Alpha, Total Asset Freeze. This wasn't just skipping a payment. This was a lockdown. It meant every credit card linked to the estate, every expense account, every fuel card for their luxury SUVs, and every line of credit was frozen instantly. I confirmed the command and watched the little padlock icon snap shut on the screen. I looked back at the VIP tent. It was glowing gold against the night sky, a beacon of excess. My mother was probably ordering another bottle of vintage champagne right now. Shelby was likely bragging to a guest about her next European vacation. They had absolutely no idea that the black cards in their clutches were now just worthless pieces of plastic. At midnight, the catering company was going to run the final bill for the Solstice Gala. It was going to be a 6-figure charge. And it was going to decline. The music would stop. The lights would stay on, but the illusion was over. I put the phone back in my pocket and walked toward my truck. I didn't need to stay to watch the explosion. Knowing I had lit the fuse was satisfaction enough. My cabin sits on the far edge of the property, tucked behind a row of ancient oaks that separate the working vineyard from the manicured lawns of the main estate. It's small, drafty in the winter, and smells permanently of soil samples and blueprints. To my mother, it's an eyesore, a place she refuses to enter because she's afraid of ruining her shoes. To me, it's the command center. I tossed my keys on the counter and scrubbed the dirt from my hands. As the water turned brown in the sink, I thought about the accusation they loved to throw at me: leech, burden, hobbyist. They truly believed that I was the one dragging them down, a barnacle on the hull of their glorious ship. They didn't realize I was the only thing keeping that ship from sinking. 5 years ago, this vineyard was dead, not dying dead. The soil chemistry was shattered from years of aggressive chemical farming that my father, Jeffrey, had authorized to boost short-term yields for quick cash. The vines were gray, the grapes were sour, and the bank was 3 months away from foreclosure. While Cynthia and Shelby were curating their Instagram feeds in Paris and Milan, pretending to be heiresses to a thriving empire, I was here, on my hands and knees, literally rebuilding the earth. I leveraged my own credit to bring in sustainable irrigation. I redesigned the architectural layout of the planting rows to maximize airflow and save the crop from rot. I didn't take a salary for 2 years. I lived on ramen and determination, so they could live on caviar and delusion. I walked over to the small, framed photo on my desk. It was the only picture I kept out. Me and my grandfather, standing in a trench, covered in mud. He was the only one who knew the truth. I remember the day he signed the trust over to me. It wasn't in a boardroom. It was in a sterile hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. He was weak, his voice barely a whisper, but his grip on my hand was iron. I had tried to argue with him. I told him he should leave it to Dad, that it would tear the family apart if he skipped a generation. He had looked at me with eyes that saw everything I tried to hide. "Your father loves the wine, Isabella," he had rasped. "He loves the bottle, the label, the price tag, the applause when he opens a vintage. But you love the vine." He squeezed my hand, pulling me closer. "One is a product, the other is a life. Jeffrey would sell the soil to buy a golden frame for a picture of a grape. He doesn't understand that you cannot paint the fence while you starve the roots." That was his burden to give, and mine to carry. He knew that if he gave the control to Jeffrey, the vineyard would be sold for parts within a year, to pay for Cynthia's social climbing. So he made me the guardian. He made me the sole trustee, not to give me power, but to give the land a protector. For 5 years, I had tried to do it quietly. I had tried to fund their lifestyle while fixing the damage they caused, hoping that if I just worked hard enough, I could save the vineyard and their egos. I thought I could be the silent architect of their comfort. But tonight, listening to the silence of my empty cabin, I realized my grandfather was right. You can't save the roots if you keep feeding the parasites. I had honored his wish to protect the land. Now, I had to honor his warning about the people living on it. The silence of the vineyard morning didn't last long. It was shattered at 9 a.m. sharp, not by a rooster, but by the screech of tires and the slamming of car doors. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, drinking black coffee and watching the security feed on my laptop. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. The catering company's trucks were still parked by the main house, their drivers standing in a cluster, arms crossed, looking unhappy. Cynthia was there, gesticulating wildly with her phone in one hand and a platinum credit card in the other. I didn't need audio to know exactly what was happening. Declined. She was trying another card. Declined. Then a third. Declined. The look on her face wasn't fear. It was a malfunction. She couldn't compute a world where her plastic didn't command obedience. Then Shelby came out, dressed in oversized sunglasses and a tracksuit, dragging a suitcase. She was heading for her post-gala recovery spa weekend in Calistoga. She stopped at her white convertible, tried the door, and then frowned. She pulled out her phone. I watched the notification pop up on my own screen. Unauthorized fuel charge attempt, $85. Status, denied. She tried again, denied. She kicked the tire of her own car. 5 minutes later, they were pounding on my cabin door. They didn't knock. They hammered until the wood shook. When I opened it, they spilled into the room like a toxic spill, filling the small space with the smell of stale champagne and expensive perfume. "What did you do?" Cynthia screamed, thrusting her phone in my face. The caterer is threatening to call the sheriff. My card isn't working. Fix it. Now. And my Uber account is locked, Shelby added, throwing herself onto my worn sofa as if it were a tragedy. I have an appointment in an hour, Isabella. I can't be late. This glitch is embarrassing. I leaned back against the counter, holding my coffee mug with both hands to warm them. I watched them, really looked at them. A normal person, faced with a sudden freeze of all assets, would ask why. They would ask if the bank had been hacked, if we were bankrupt, if something terrible had happened. But my family didn't ask why. They demanded restitution. It fascinated me. Psychologists call this a narcissistic injury. It occurs when a narcissist's false self, the image of perfection and power they project to the world, is challenged or shattered. For Cynthia and Shelby, money wasn't currency, it was identity. They had spent decades conflating the act of spending with the act of earning. In their minds, swiping a card was a talent, a job description. They truly believed they generated the wealth simply by existing to spend it. By cutting off the flow, I hadn't just inconvenienced them, I had erased their personalities. It's not a glitch, I said, my voice quiet but cutting through their noise. And I'm not fixing it. The accounts are frozen because I froze them. Cynthia stopped moving. Her face went from red to a terrifying shade of pale. You what? You're stealing from us? I'm auditing you, I corrected. There's a difference. You can't do this, Shelby shrieked, standing up. That's our money. Daddy earned that money. Daddy hasn't earned a profit since 2010, I said. I earned it. I saved it. And now, I'm keeping it. Cynthia stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into slits. You are going to unlock those cards right now. Or I will call the family lawyer and have you declared incompetent. I will tell everyone you've had a breakdown. I will ruin you, Isabella. Do you hear me? She wasn't scared of poverty. She was offended by my audacity. She couldn't conceive of a reality where she wasn't the queen and I wasn't the servant. She thought this was a rebellion she could crush with a threat. She didn't realize the castle had already fallen. Call him, I said, taking a sip of coffee. Call the lawyer. Actually, save the battery. I'm going to see him in San Francisco this afternoon. You can tell him all about my breakdown then. I drove away from the vineyard without looking in the rearview mirror. The air in the cabin had been suffocating, thick with their entitlement. But the air on the Golden Gate Bridge was sharp and clearing. I wasn't running away. I was moving the battlefield to a location where tantrums didn't count, but evidence did. The offices of the trust's legal team in San Francisco were high above the fog line. It was a world of glass, steel, and silence. A stark contrast to the emotional mud wrestling I'd been doing for 5 years. I turned off my phone, silencing the barrage of abusive texts from my mother, and walked into the conference room. They've been busy, Isabella, the lead attorney said, sliding a thick file across the mahogany table. He didn't look happy. I opened it. It wasn't financial data yet, it was correspondence. Emails, text logs, and affidavits from board members of the local winery association. While I was freezing the accounts, Shelby had been lighting fires. She had been systematically contacting every influential person in the valley, planting seeds of doubt about my sanity. Isabella is cracking under the pressure. She's having episodes. We're worried she's becoming a danger to the estate. It was a whisper campaign, designed to paint me as unstable, so they could petition the court to remove me as trustee. They weren't just reacting to the freeze. They had been planning a coup for months. They want to frame this as a medical emergency, the lawyer said. They want conservatorship. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. Let them try. Because I'm not bringing a medical record to this fight. I'm bringing a calculator. I turned to the forensic accountant sitting at the end of the table. Show me the red ink. He projected a spreadsheet onto the wall. It was a map of financial hemorrhaging. I expected the spa trips, the designer clothes, the vanity dinners. I was prepared for greed. I wasn't prepared for the crime. We found a recurring line item, the accountant said, pointing to a series of transfers highlighted in crimson, labeled vintage acquisition costs. totaling $400,000 over the last 24 months. We haven't acquired vintage stock in 3 years, I said, my voice flat. We grow our own. Exactly. The payments went to a consulting firm registered in Nevada. It's a shell company, Isabella. We traced the ownership. It leads back to a private account linked to Shelby. The room seemed to drop a few degrees. My sister wasn't just a spoiled brat with a shopping addiction. She was an embezzler. We dug deeper, the accountant continued. The money didn't stay in her account. It went out almost immediately to 3 entities. One is an offshore casino. The other 2 are private lenders with aggressive repayment terms. The pieces clicked into place with the terrifying precision of a gunslide. The golden child didn't just have a spending problem. She had a secret life. She was drowning in gambling debt, and she had been stealing from the family harvest to keep the sharks away. She wasn't fighting for her allowance because she wanted a new purse. She was fighting because she was terrified. This isn't a family dispute anymore, I said, staring at the numbers on the wall. This is a felony. I looked at the lawyer. Draft the report. Not a summary. The full forensic breakdown. Every stolen dime, every fraudulent invoice, every signature. Isabella, he warned gently. If we file this, there is no going back. Shelby could go to prison. I thought about the mud on my boots. I thought about the whispers they spread about my sanity. I thought about the grandfather who trusted me to protect the vines from rot. The rot is deep, I said. Cut it out. The main dining room of the estate had always felt like a courtroom to me. The long mahogany table, the imposing portraits of ancestors on the walls, the heavy silence that absorbed sound like a sponge. Growing up, this was where I stood trial for my muddy boots and my lack of social ambition. Today, I sat at the head of the table, waiting for the defendants to arrive. They walked in at noon, precisely on time, flanking their lawyer like a phalanx. Jeffrey wore his serious business suit, the one he saved for meetings with bankers he was trying to charm. Cynthia wore black, somber and elegant, as if she were mourning the daughter she was about to commit. Shelby brought up the rear, looking pale but smug. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She thought the game was over. She thought she had won. Their lawyer, a man named Sterling, who charged $500 an hour to help rich people hide their mistakes, placed a thick stack of documents in front of me. Isabella, my father began, his voice dripping with rehearsed concern. We love you. You know that. But your behavior over the last week, the freezing of assets, the paranoia, the isolation. It's clear you aren't yourself. We're worried about you, Cynthia added, dabbing at a dry eye. The stress of the vineyard. It's broken you. We just want you to get help. Sterling tapped the paper. This is a petition for an emergency conservatorship. Given the affidavits regarding your mental state, we believe the court will grant temporary control of the trust to your father until you are, well, I looked at the papers. They had done it. They had weaponized my exhaustion, my hard work, and my solitude against me. They had built a cage out of lies, and were waiting for me to walk into it. I didn't touch their papers. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the forensic report. It was bound in a simple black folder. I slid it across the mahogany surface. It spun slowly, and stopped directly in front of Sterling. I'm not tired, Jeffrey, I said, my voice steady. I'm not paranoid, and I'm certainly not crazy. I'm an auditor. Sterling opened the folder. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I saw the exact moment the color drained from his face. He stopped reading. He looked up at me, then at Shelby, then back at the numbers. He closed the folder. What is that? Shelby asked. Her voice shrill. That, I said, is the trail of the $400,000 you stole. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that happens after a gunshot. Vintage acquisition costs, I recited from memory. Nevada Shell Corporation. Offshore transfers. It's all there, Shelby. The dates, the amounts, the digital signatures. You didn't just overspend on shoes. You embezzled from a federal trust to pay off gambling debts. That's wire fraud. That's tax evasion. That's 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Shelby stood up, knocking her chair back. You're lying. She's lying, Daddy. She's making it up. The forensic accountant isn't lying, I said coldly. And neither is the paper trail. I turned my gaze to my father. He was staring at Shelby, his mouth open. He wasn't looking at her with fatherly concern. He was looking at her like she was a liability. He was doing the math in his head, realizing that his name was on the checks she had forged his signature on, or that he had signed blindly in his negligence. Jeffrey, I said softly, you signed off on the quarterly reports. Did you know? Or were you just too busy playing Lord of the Manor to notice your favorite daughter was looting the treasury? I didn't know, he stammered, backing away from the table, physically distancing himself from Shelby. I had no idea. She handled the invoices. I trusted her. Daddy, Shelby whispered. You stole from us? Jeffrey shouted at her, his face turning purple. You stupid girl, you exposed us. It was a masterclass in cowardice. In seconds, he went from the concerned patriarch here to save his mentally ill daughter to a rat jumping off a sinking ship. He threw her to the wolves without a second thought to save his own skin. Mr. Sterling, I said. You came here to declare me incompetent. But it seems the only incompetence in this room is criminal. You can file your petition, but if you do, I file this report with the district attorney. Your choice. Sterling pushed his chair back. He looked at Jeffrey, then at the weeping Shelby, and shook his head. I can't represent you in this, he said. Conflict of interest. I'm leaving. As the lawyer walked out, the air in the room changed. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the raw, metallic scent of fear. They weren't holding an intervention anymore. They were hostages. Sterling was gone, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the vaulted ceiling. Shelby was sobbing into her hands, a broken, terrified sound. Jeffrey was pouring himself a drink with shaking hands, abandoning the pretense of being a father to focus on being a drunk. But Cynthia wasn't done. She stood up, smoothing the front of her black dress. She looked around the dining room at the crystal chandelier, the velvet drapes, the ancestral portraits she had paid a fortune to restore. She drew strength from the objects. She believed that possession was 9/10 of the law, and she was currently standing in her castle. Fine, she spat, her voice trembling with venom. You've proven your point. You've humiliated your sister. You've scared off the lawyer. Are you happy? Now get out of my house. She pointed a manicured finger at the door. You can freeze the accounts, Isabella. You can send Shelby to jail. But this is my home. This estate belongs to us. And you are trespassing. I looked at her finger, shaking in the air. It was a fascinating study in delusion. There is a profound difference between social capital and structural capital. My family had spent their entire lives hoarding social capital. They collected dinner invitations, magazine features, the envy of their neighbors, and the perception of power. They believed that because they looked like the owners, they were the owners. They thought power was a performance. But structural capital is boring. It lives in filing cabinets, in county clerk offices, in the dense, unreadable paragraphs of legal deeds. It doesn't glitter. It doesn't get likes on Instagram. But it is the only thing that is actually real. They had built a life on the stage. I held the deed to the theater. I didn't leave. I reached into my bag one last time. I pulled out a single, thin document. It wasn't a forensic report. It was a property deed, yellowed slightly at the edges, dated 5 years ago. You're wrong, Cynthia, I said softly. About what? She snapped. About whose house this is. I placed the deed on the table. Grandfather knew Jeffrey would sell the land the moment the wine stopped selling. He knew you would liquidate the soil to buy more silk. So he didn't just give me the money. He split the asset. Jeffrey stopped drinking. He stared at the paper. He created the Terra Firma Land Trust, I explained, my voice devoid of emotion. He put every acre of this vineyard, every vine, every barn, and this mansion into it. He severed the physical property from the operating capital. And he named a single beneficiary. I tapped the signature line. Me? Cynthia grabbed the table for support. No, that's not possible. We live here. You occupy the space, I corrected. But you don't own the dirt. You are tenants. Guests. And you have been terrible tenants. I pulled 3 envelopes from my bag. They were white, crisp, and legal. I slid one to Shelby, one to Jeffrey, and one to Cynthia. These are eviction notices, I said. 30 days. That's the legal requirement in California. I suggest you start packing today. The vintage furniture is mine, by the way. It's listed in the inventory. You can't kick us out, Jeffrey roared, finding a sudden, desperate bravery. I'm your father. I raised you in this house. You raised me in the dirt, I said, standing up. Now I'm reclaiming it. I walked to the door. I didn't look back at the sobbing sister, the stunned mother, or the father who had realized he was king of nothing. Get off my land, I said. 6 months later, the mansion was quiet. But it wasn't the dead silence of abandonment. It was the quiet of rest. Scaffolding covered the west wing where my team was installing solar panels. The old chemical sheds were gone, replaced by a composting facility. The sign at the gate no longer read private estate. It read Terra Firma Eco Lodge and Research Center. My parents were gone. They had moved into a small, 2-bedroom condo in Santa Rosa. It was nice enough, but to them, it was a prison cell. Cynthia spent her days complaining to anyone who would listen about her ungrateful daughter, but fewer people were listening. Jeffrey had tried to start a wine consulting business, but it turns out nobody wants advice from a man who bankrupted a gold mine. Shelby was still in court. The embezzlement charges were sticking. She had tried to plea bargain, offering to testify against Jeffrey for negligence, but the DA wasn't interested in the negligent father. They wanted the thief. She was looking at community service, massive restitution, and a felony record that would keep her out of any boardroom for life. I walked the rows of the vineyard as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the valley. The vines were heavy with fruit, organic, robust, and thriving. We had just bottled our first vintage under the new label. I named it The Verdict. It was a deep, complex red, with notes of earth and iron. It tasted like victory. It hurt to cut them off. I won't lie. There were nights I woke up missing the idea of a family, missing the fantasy of a mother who loved me and a father who protected me. But then, I would look at the thriving land, at the happy staff who were finally being paid a living wage, and I would remember the truth. Pruning isn't an act of cruelty, it is an act of love for the plant. You have to cut away the dead wood, the diseased branches, the suckers that drain energy without producing fruit. If you don't, the rot spreads, and the whole organism dies. I had pruned my family tree to save my life. I stopped at the end of a row and looked out over the valley. For the first time in 28 years, the air didn't smell like their perfume or their expectations. It smelled like soil. It smelled like growth. It smelled like mine. They told me I was dirty because I worked with my hands. But dirt is where life grows. Don't let anyone who just consumes tell you that your creation isn't valuable. If you've ever had to prune the dead wood from your life to save your own sanity, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power. And tell me in the comments, what's one boundary you need to set today?